So I've been living in the Netherlands for a little under 1 year. Here in just a few days, it will actually have been 1 full calendar year since I landed in Amsterdam and made the Netherlands my second home. And in that time, I've made various videos like this one explaining how the Dutch infrastructure is much better, or at the very least, much different than American infrastructure. But something that I haven't really talked that much about is how the people actually enable this infrastructure to exist. And what do I mean by that? Well, a lot of the things that I talk about, for example, the bike lanes and just various other components of Dutch infrastructure, wouldn't really work the same way if you just up and place them in America. If you were to take all of the Dutch people out of the Netherlands and just replace them with Americans, this society would not function the same way, because Americans, with their conditioning, are simply different than Dutch people. They have different values, different belief systems, etc., that would not allow the society to function the same way as Dutch society functions with Dutch people. That said, in this video I want to talk about some things that Dutch people do that Americans don't do, at least the average American doesn't do, that allow this society to function the way that it does. The first of which being riding their bikes without judgment. Okay, that is the stipulation. Dutch people ride their bicycles without judgment. And what this does is it normalizes cycling as not just a recreational activity for people who can afford those $10,000 street bikes, but it also, let me go this way. I actually don't know where I'm walking right now. I'm just kind of roaming around, but it also makes it more socially acceptable. It just makes it socially acceptable for people to ride their bikes to get from point A to point B. You see, back home, especially in Dallas, maybe it's different in some of the more dense American cities, but in Dallas, a car-centric city, a lot of things, a lot of society operates based on status. Now, to be fair, Dutch society does as well. That's just human nature. But here, your status is less associated with the material items that you have and the amount of money that you have. And in many ways, it's the reverse. It's more about how frugal can you be? How considerate can you be of the people around you? And cycling is a great way to showcase that you care about the environment, that you care about your health and well-being, and that you generally want to be a part of this society. I know I'm going a little bit deeper than you probably expected here, but this is just the truth about these social constructs, is that the social infrastructure is what enables the physical infrastructure to exist the way that it does. And riding bikes is, once again, a great way to enable the physical infrastructure to exist. Because if nobody is going to ride the bikes on the bike lanes, then the government, the people who build the bike lanes, cannot justify spending the money to build them. So there has to be demand in order for there to be supply. And here there is a lot of demand because, once again, people are able to ride their bikes free of judgment. There's no societal expectation that as an adult you're supposed to have a car, and a nice car at that, otherwise you're less fortunate. I haven't seen that here. Maybe it does exist in pockets, but in the part of the Netherlands that I live in Brabant, that is not the case. People ride their bikes, adults ride their bikes. It's normal. It's completely normal. Back home in Dallas, like I said, status is everything. Materialism plays a big role in the social infrastructure. So if you're an adult riding your bike, people will look at you differently. Even if just subconsciously, even if they don't know that they're doing it, people are going to look at you in a different way for riding a bike. Or let's say, for example, you can see up here one of these scooters. I would also include this in the biking category. If you ride a scooter like this back home, people are definitely gonna let you hear about it, or they're gonna look at you differently. At least you'll never really see people back home riding scooters like that, but here it's just normal for children and adults alike. People are okay with these alternative forms of transportation, and truthfully, that's the way it should be. That's the way that it should be. But back home, that is not the way that it is, which is a big part of the reason why there aren't that many bike lanes, which is a big part of the reason why there aren't many cyclists. The chicken or the egg. They are both there, they both exist. Doesn't matter which one came first. That said, the next thing that Dutch people do that Americans don't, and again, cannot stress this enough, I'm from Dallas, I'm not from New York, I'm not from one of the big dense urban areas, I'm from Dallas. Something that Dutch people do that people in Dallas don't do, and people in most of the US don't do, is ride public transit. Ride public transit for much of the same reasons why they don't ride bikes back home. It's a status thing. There is this sort of association of poverty, I mean, for lack of a better term, of poverty with public transport, public transit, that is. People back home will look at you differently if you rely on public transit, and truthfully, their assumptions aren't entirely inaccurate. Generally speaking, back home, the only people that are relying on public transit as their primary mode of transportation are people who don't have a whole lot of money, people who are poor. The same with biking. So it is true. It's true, literally, but that doesn't make it right. It's true, but it's not right in my personal opinion. But that's just the way that it is. If you ride that public transit back home, you take the DART train, Dallas Area Rapid Transit, people are gonna look at you differently. They will look at you differently. They might even treat you differently. It's not right, but it's true. Here, public transit is normal. And because it's normalized, because you can ride public transit without judgment, because really your average adult probably takes public transit, and I don't have a statistic to back that up, so correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I would imagine that the majority of adults here utilize public transit throughout the year at some point or another, even if they have a car. Because it's normalized, people feel more comfortable with doing it. Because again, it conveys status just in a different way. It conveys status according to the Dutch ideal of status, not the American ideal of status. The Dutch ideal of status being tied to community and selflessness. Like I said, back home, it's just a whole different dynamic, and that is a big part of the reason why the public transit is so slow to develop in cities like Dallas or even places like LA, is because nobody wants to ride it. Nobody wants to ride it because they don't want to be seen as that person who can't afford a car. It's just not right, but it's true. The chicken and the egg. Now, of course, there is the idea of induced demand, so replacing some of the car infrastructure with public transit infrastructure. I don't know that that would go over very well in Dallas, to be honest with you. I really don't think that that would go over too well in a place like Dallas, where people value quote-unquote freedom, even though their idea of freedom involves not being able to go anywhere if you don't have a $10,000 or $20,000 car. But I digress. That's a different discussion for a different day. the next thing that Dutch people do that people back home don't do is they pay attention when they drive. Now this is a sweeping generalization, just like everything else that I talk about in not only this video, but all of my other videos about the Netherlands. This is a big generalization. I paid attention when I drove back home. There are people here that don't pay attention when they drive. But by and large, what I've observed is that the average Dutch person is much more attentive than your average American when they're behind the wheel of a car. And there are a few reasons for this. And before I get into those reasons, I want to show you an example of what I mean. So you can see right here, hopefully you can see, it's very sunny, so it might mess with the exposure of the camera, but you can see this is an intersection, a small intersection, but an intersection nonetheless. What you don't see is a stop sign. There are no stop signs here. How is this possible? This is possible because there is a rule here where the person on the right, more often than not, has the right of way. And I find this to be really fascinating because that would never work back home. You cannot have an intersection without stop signs back home. We have stop signs and traffic lights, and people still crash. People still run the stop signs. They still run the red lights because they're not paying attention. They might be on their phone. They might be dozing off, thinking about something else, whatever else. They don't pay attention in the same way that Dutch drivers do. And again, I have a few reasons, or a few theoretical reasons for this. The first of which being that most cars here are manual, and driving a stick shift or manual car requires you to be more attentive. You can't not pay attention when driving a stick shift car. But aside from that, the driving school here and the driving test seems a lot more challenging. When my girlfriend took her driving test, she failed probably 3 or 4 times, but she finally got it. She finally got her license. She told me that the test took, I want to say, 30 minutes to an hour to complete the driving test. And then of course, you had the driving lessons before that. Not only was it hard, but it was expensive as well. I think she spent somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 euros to obtain her driver's license. If she had passed on the first time, it probably would have been 1,500 to 2,000. So it's expensive. When I took the driver test, I want to say it took 15 minutes at most to complete. And that was that. I mean, we literally drove up the street. I think I had to reverse a little bit. I did a 3-point turn and I parallel parked, and that was it. 15 minutes, boom, I have my license. Literally the same day, I was driving my friend and I ran over the curb. I was not ready to drive yet. I was definitely not prepared to drive, but I kind of learned on the fly and I became a good driver. I've never been in an accident to this day. Never gotten a speeding ticket, only been pulled over once. I'm a good driver. The average American is not. Like I said, they are not attentive. And again, the reason why I'm saying this is because the road infrastructure here would never work. Oh, another reason why Dutch drivers are more attentive is because of how the roads are structured. So this is something I'm probably gonna have to make a whole separate video about, but basically on Dutch roads, there are almost always measures that are taken and they're built into the infrastructure to ensure that people pay attention. So even the roads themselves, sometimes they're set up to where you have oncoming traffic driving towards each other on a one-way street, or a one-lane street that is, and the only way for the drivers to pass is they have to pull off of the road slightly to pass each other. That would never work back home. Absolutely not. That would never, ever work. People would be dying left and right. There would be protests, maybe riots. That wouldn't work. Because the Dutch drivers are more attentive than the American drivers. So I'm saying this to say once again that this infrastructure, this road infrastructure, wouldn't work in the US. Even though it's more efficient, I've yet to see a single traffic jam since I got here. And again, I've been here almost a year. It just wouldn't work. It just would not work because the drivers in the Netherlands are much better than the drivers back home. Not to say that the drivers back home can't become as good as the drivers here, but I mean, you have so many drivers on the road already who basically had the same driver's test that I had, and just like me, or just like I did, are learning on the fly, learning as they go. Just wouldn't work very well. So you can't really mimic or even take much inspiration from the Dutch road infrastructure in the US. They have to find a different way. Now, the next thing that a lot of Dutch people do that most Americans don't do is travel internationally. Now, to be fair, the Netherlands is a small country. It takes maybe 3 to 4 hours to drive across the whole entire country. Texas takes around 16 hours to drive across by itself. So you can imagine the whole US. I think going from LA to New York is something like 41 hours. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's somewhere around 40 to 50 hours, somewhere in that range. So it does make sense that some people, hold on, it is getting really windy out here. It does make sense that a lot of people back home never see another country in their lifetimes, because if you live in the middle of the US, you're literally at minimum a 5-hour flight away from any other country or any other city in any other country. Nobody is trying to go to Winnipeg, Canada. I'm sorry. If you're from Winnipeg, no offense, but nobody's really trying to go there. Might be a great place, but nobody's trying to go there. They want to go to Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, or if they're going to Mexico, they want to go to Mexico City, Cancun, or I forgot the name of the city, but there's a city that's pretty much right on the border of Mexico and California. Go ahead and sit down because it is really cold and windy, and I've been walking for a long time here. But basically, if you live in a place like Kansas or Nebraska or somewhere like that, you're probably not going to be able to go internationally for less than $1,000. And of course, your average American doesn't really have that kind of money. Here, you can just hop on a train, where I live at least, you can hop on a train and you can be in Belgium in an hour. I think when my girlfriend and I went to Antwerp, it took maybe an hour and a half from Tilburg. I think we started at Tilburg and went to Antwerp, and it was around an hour and a half of a train ride. It's just not the case back home. It's simply not the case back home. And because of that, people back home tend to have a much narrower perspective of the world as a whole. They tend to have a much narrower perspective, whereas here, people have much broader horizons because they've just seen more. They've seen more things, they've experienced more of what the world has to offer, they've been around different languages, they've been around different cultural customs, and it shows in their general progressiveness in day-to-day life and in their political views. Now, this is not a political video. I'm not a very political person myself, but it's literally a fact that the Netherlands is a much more progressive country than the US. And you also see this within the US, that the cities that are more multicultural and have more of an international influence tend to be overwhelmingly progressive compared to their less international counterparts. That's no coincidence. People who have broader horizons, who have seen more of what the world has to offer, tend to be more progressive because they tend to be more compassionate about, well, other cultures. So this has nothing really to do with the infrastructure, but with the politics. And again, I don't really want to get too deep into politics, but the politics are what enable the infrastructure. And generally speaking, once again, even within the US, the cities that are more multicultural, more internationally influenced, tend to have more of the infrastructure that I've mentioned in this video. They tend to have the public transit, they tend to have the bike lanes, not to the same extent, not nearly to the same extent that the Netherlands does. But that's no coincidence that that's the case. It's because they tend to be more progressive, which tends to be because it's more multicultural. I know I'm kind of just talking in circles here, but I think you get the gist of what I'm saying, is that the fact that the Netherlands has so much exposure, or the Dutch people have so much exposure to different environments, allows them to think beyond what they already know. And that's what allows infrastructure like this to exist. And once again, I don't want to get too deep into politics. I know that some people are concerned about the direction that the Netherlands is going in politically, but let me just say this. When it comes to day-to-day life here in the Netherlands, it is leaps and bounds more progressive than back home. I mean, really, that's another thing I would say that Dutch people do that Americans don't, is Dutch people mind their business. I mean, when it comes to things like gay marriage, when it comes to abortion rights, I mean, these are things that, in my opinion, I don't even consider these to be political issues. These are things that shouldn't even be discussed. It's just common sense, in my opinion, that if two people want to get married, they should be able to get married. If somebody wants to get an abortion, they should be able to get an abortion. I don't consider that to be a liberal ideology. It's just common sense, which is why I don't consider myself to be political. This is a common sense issue that is literally taking up air. We shouldn't be arguing or debating about things like this. I've gone on a complete tangent, but the moral of this video, the primary takeaway that I want you to have from this video, is that you can't simply take the Dutch infrastructure, put it in the US, and expect it to function the same way, because Americans are fundamentally different people.